to continue, and welcome. Welcome everyone to our monthly meeting for lawyers involved in post-conviction work, prosecutors and defense side. As most of you know, I think my name is Marissa Bluestein, and my colleague Kia Hayes and I work here at the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. And we hold these meetings every month as part of a grant we have from the Bureau of Justice Administration to provide technical training and assistance to those of you engaged in post-conviction work. And this month, we do apologize for the kind of discombobulated timing, because usually these meetings are on the second Wednesday of the month from 2 to 3:15 p.m. Eastern. However, because the subject matter was so important and we had a conflict with the presenters, we agreed to move this about. So I appreciate everybody kind of sticking with us in terms of how things have moved around a bit, but I promise you it's worth it. So for today, we are focusing in on investigative interviewing or science-based interviewing. And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, you soon will be, because the two folks who are presenting today, and I'm so grateful to have you, are Matt Jones and Melissa Rossano. They are both leaders in this field. They are actively engaged in working with law enforcement to develop and train in new techniques of interviewing and interrogations in ways that are non-coercive, that are respectful of autonomy and agency for the person being interviewed, and which actually gets more actionable information from the interaction than a more coercive interview that you probably are more familiar with. And moreover, as a not insignificant side benefit, do not yield false confessions. And we will hear more about the science of that from Dr. Melissa Rossano. Dr. Rossano is a professor at the Roger Williams University. She in the forensic psychology department, and she is a leading expert in the country on false confessions and interrogations. It's not just a matter of research for her. She actually does the trainings involved applying the science to working directly with law enforcement and working hard to kind of change the way that law enforcement is conducting interviews almost literally as we speak. Our other guest is former Detective Matt Jones. Detective Jones retired from the Tucson Police Department several years ago to pursue full-time the work that he's going to talk to us about today. So Detective Jones was, I think, the first law enforcement individual to attend training through HIG, which is a Department of Defense funded research training program called the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. Went through that on his own, learned the techniques, went and got his master's in forensic psychology, and has been using those techniques and refining them for the use here in the United States with law enforcement. So I'm just 100% thrilled to have them both with us today. Detective Jones, Dr. Rossano, thank you so much for your time. I know that they would very much like to hear from you. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will be watching the chat for them, and we will be happy to incorporate them into the presentation as we go along. And then finally, at the end of this program, I have two polls that I'm going to launch. One is for those who are interested in setting up a training for your team, either within your team directly or with others. That could be for prosecutors or for innocence lawyers, doesn't matter. We will follow up with you and see if we can help arrange that through the grant that we have from Bureau of Justice Administration to help subsidize that, to be able to make that training happen for you. And the second, of course, is an evaluative poll on this, asking you for other ideas for trainings for future. And at the end of this, my colleague Kia Hayes will tell you about what's coming up the next couple months we have. But for today, I'm handing it over to Detective Jones and Dr. Rossano. Thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, thank you very much, Marissa. And for those of you that were scheduled for last week, we're expecting this presentation, I apologize, we had to make the change. That was purely my fault. I contracted COVID after all these years and thought I was invincible, and it was a very humbling experience. So I'm actually glad to be here before you today, and thank you again for rearranging your schedules and coming back this week. So my name is Matt Jones. I actually was not with the Tucson Police Department. I was with the Tempe Police Department out here in Arizona. And my background spanned between 3 different law enforcement agencies over the last 21 years. What happened that's really, I think, of value for all of you is not what I did while I was in law enforcement, but what I started to get involved in on my way out the door from law enforcement. And that happened back around 2013. I started looking at the interview curriculums that we have been teaching all across the country and started to look at the research that was supposedly supporting these curriculums. And to my surprise, I could not find any research that was supporting what we were teaching to federal, state, and local law enforcement. But I did find a lot of research that was supporting that what we were doing in these curriculums and how we were conducting these interviews was actually working against us and also contributing to false confessions. And it was from that curiosity that I reached out to researchers with the government's high value detainee interrogation group, also known as the HIG. These researchers were doing grant funded projects sponsored by the HIG, looking at research surrounding investigative interviewing that was non-coercive and ethical. And from that, I began to get in contact with folks like Dr. Melissa Rossano here, and really developed my sense of curiosity about how we could improve investigative interviewing. This curiosity, I will tell you very quickly, got the best of me. I got sucked into the research community and started getting involved in the research projects themselves and trying to help the researchers to better facilitate how do we present these techniques to investigators and how they use the techniques. And from that, we started to
surprised he doesn't have his head handed to him where he's working. I mean, and the other thing is, like, say it once if you have, but like once is.
Let me see if we can mute her. There we go. From that, we were able to start talking about developing a curriculum that we could then teach to local law enforcement as well. And we'll get to that in a little bit, but let me turn this over to Dr. Rossano to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I also want to thank you all for being here and for Marissa for inviting us. As she mentioned, I am a professor at Roger Williams University, which is in Rhode Island, although I live across the border in Massachusetts. And my journey to here in this room started back when I was a graduate student. I have a PhD, a master's in legal psychology. And so I'm a research psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist. And I went to a conference and I heard a talk by a man named Saul Kassan, whose name you might be familiar with for those of you who have worked at false confession cases. And I had that aha moment where I thought, oh my God, why would anyone falsely confess to something they didn't do? That's just fascinating. And that's where my journey began around the year 2000 or so. And so from that point on, I've been conducting research in the area of interviewing and interrogation. And I started where most researchers start, which is that fascination with false confessions. But it has broadened since then to really try and focus in on not only how can things go wrong, but how do we do it better? So what techniques can we use to facilitate the elicitation of information, whether it's from a witness, a source, a victim, right? Or a suspect, in a way that is both ethical, of course, but also diagnostic. So we're using techniques that should elicit reliable information while minimizing the chance that we're going to get false or unreliable information from the person. So I've conducted lots of different types of studies, from laboratory studies to field research to training evaluations. You'll hear a little bit about the latter today. And through that, I became one of those HIG-funded researchers that Matt mentioned. The HIG, for those of you who don't know, came into existence in around the year 2010. I can certainly, Matt and I can talk about that organization if there's interest in understanding, but what you need to know for now is basically that it is both an operational entity, but also it funds research. And it has funded me since 2010. I've been funded through them on a variety of projects. It's how Matt and I ultimately met through those connections. And it was the HIG who funded me and my colleagues to do a training evaluation for some interview training that they were doing, which then led to an evaluation of a training that Matt and I developed. And now that and since then, we've been delivering those types of trainings to other law enforcement agencies. So yeah, I'm happy to be here, and I think Matt's going to take it from here, and we'll be jumping back and forth between us.
Okay, give me just a second to pull this up.
as Matt does that, I'll just say, I think we're both really open to questions as we go along. So please don't be afraid to interrupt us, either through the chat, or if you want to turn your camera on, we'll see you and you can wave your hand, or however you want to signal us.
Okay, thank you. So just as we do with the trainings we provide to investigators, we always have a practitioner like myself and a researcher involved in these trainings. So these investigators are getting the best of both worlds. They're getting the practitioner talking about the actual experience of using these techniques out in the field. And then they're getting the research component where the researchers can come in and answer these questions of why these things are problematic and why we have these risk factors. So we're going to use that kind of combination throughout this presentation today. And as Melissa said, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to jump in at any time and ask your questions. We'd love to hear from you as we go through this, especially any of the challenges that you're experiencing out in the field. So when we talk about the science-based interview training, I think it's important to not only talk about where we're at right now, but also where we've come from. And I like this slide to talk about the training transitions that we've gone through in local law enforcement. Specifically, back in the 1920s and 40s, we had this period of time where we were physically beating confessions out of people. And this was just a really difficult time in law enforcement. We were receiving a lot of criticism for how we were conducting our investigations and how we were eliciting these confessions. But then we had this transition after the 1940s where we moved away from the physical coercion into more of the psychological coercion. And this is where we started to use these techniques that were more confrontational and accusatorial, but from a psychological standpoint. And this is where we see this curriculum being developed, that the confrontational accusatorial types of curriculums that are still prevalent today, 80 years later, they dominate the types of interview training that we are seeing provided to local law enforcement and at the federal level all across the country. However, back in 2010, as Melissa already mentioned, we had the development of the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. This is a three-sided partnership between the FBI, the CIA, and the DoD. And one of their mandates is to present training to federal investigators, but it's also to fund research into ethical science-based interviewing practices that can then inform the training out in the field as well. So researchers such as Melissa and others have received grants from the HIG to conduct this research. I have been fortunate enough to be involved in these projects since 2015. And this is really what's pushing this whole transition now that we're seeing into this science-based informational gathering area here in the US. Now, in talking about this prior approach for the last 80 years that we've been using, is it supported by the research? And the simple answer from that is no, okay? What has been driving these types of confrontational accusatorial types of curriculum is what is called customary knowledge. That customary knowledge was taken from law enforcement through anecdotal-based trainings, through shared experiences about what they thought worked best, and also, amazingly, from what they saw actually working on in the TV and in the movies. So this is how they were developing these interview curriculums. I can tell you, and I know I'm dating myself, back when we used to get faxes coming to our agency every single day, I would see these faxes coming in from a retired FBI agent or someone with the ATF talking about how their interview curriculum was the greatest thing ever and that this is what will work best to get confessions. This is what we've been sending our folks to from local law enforcement for the last 80 years. Okay, there's been nothing to support that these curriculums are effective. And this is what we're trying to now move away from and start looking at what types of training have actually been validated by the research. The other challenge for local law enforcement is that they've never been asked, have you vetted the training curriculums that you are providing to your officers? Along with that, they don't know how to vet out which training programs have actually been validated. So this is something else that we're working around now with the science-based interview techniques. Melissa, if you wouldn't mind jumping in here, I'd like you to talk about how the customary knowledge compares to what we're seeing now with the science-based tactics and why they're different and why this difference is important for everyone to understand. Sure.
So when we, and I would like to point out that that first shift where we moved from sort of physical methods of persuasion, for lack of a better word, to psychological was well meant, and it was an improvement over where we were, right? But as Matt pointed out, we've been doing that approach for about 80 years, and we haven't updated it. It hasn't evolved with the science. And there has been science to evolve it. And we do have this 2010 demarcation almost, where we saw a huge increase in funding for this type of research. But I do want to point out that the science of investigative interviewing has been around longer than that. It's been building and building through for at least 20 to 30 years prior to the Higgs existence. So when we talk about science-based techniques, we're not just talking about the more recent funding and specific research, but an entire body of psychological literature on memory and perception and persuasion that we can build upon. The other thing that I will say is when we say the term investigative interviewing, we're using that really broadly to cover not only suspect interviewing, which I understand is certainly an important focus for this group, but also
I think Melissa got frozen for a second there. Hey, Melissa, if you can hear us, I think your internet froze up.
Just the hazards of virtual learning. Matt, can you maybe pick it up for a moment till we get Melissa back?
Yeah, okay. So one of the areas that we like to touch on here when we talk about the research is how it's different than what has been done with the customary practice. So let's think about this. When a researcher like Melissa wants to put forth a research project that's looking into investigative interviewing, whether it's how to develop rapport, how to handle resistance, they can't just go out and present these programs to local law enforcement without going through a process. And this is called the scientific process here. First, they develop a hypothesis. For example, active listening helps to facilitate information disclosure, which also helps to facilitate rapport. And once they develop this hypothesis, then what they want to do is test the hypothesis and actually go through tests to identify whether or not this is actually effective. We take that information that we collect through pre and post interviews, and we code that information to substantiate whether or not the hypothesis is proven to be true or not. And then after that, the research will take this information and put it forth before peer review, before it can be publicated. If anybody has ever tried to take research and put it before a peer review committee, it is absolutely terrifying. This is where a committee of experts in the field that you are doing the research on tears apart everything that you've done, okay? What's nice about this is that this helps to weed out junk science from getting through and being published. And this is a really important process that never took place with the customary knowledge type of curriculums that we are presenting in the past. And then after the peer review, and then after it gets published, then we like to see it go through a replication process where we are actually seeing this go out in the field to independent research labs and seeing if they can replicate the same studies and same results, I should say. So this is really important for us to understand that this process really helps us to weed out the junk science from what we know can be validated out in the field as being effective. And this is also how we improve upon prior research. So this is one area that we'd like to talk about here in terms of how these science-based techniques are developed. Now, why have these science techniques been developed in the interview specifically? Well, when we look at this, specifically with wrongful convictions, this is the one area where we like to talk about the advantages of the science-based techniques because we're removing a lot of the risk factors. We know that some of the leading causes of wrongful conviction related specifically to DNA cases, mistaken eyewitness identification, 69%, junk forensic science, another one at 43%, false confessions, 29%, and also informant-based information is also prevalent in these wrongful conviction cases. So these are the areas that we really start to focus in on and how can we mitigate the effects of these risk factors from influencing more wrongful conviction cases here. And this is what the science-based interview techniques have been developed to do. is to reduce the likelihood of mistaken eyewitness identifications, to reduce the likelihood of these risk factors with false confessions especially. So we're going to address some of these as we get through the curriculum today, but please, if you have questions, feel free to ask.
Hey,
Marissa,
Matt, I just wanted to let you know that I'm back. I apologize.
Okay, I thought you were ghosting me for the rest of the
Sometimes we're experiencing some pretty bad storms and thunderstorms. So I think it's causing some connectivity issues on I could continue to hear you, but you could not hear me. So
okay, so why don't you jump in here, because this was actually my worst nightmare coming in today, that I'm going to get all the research slides and your audio would go out. So please jump right in.
I apologize. So I'm assuming that Matt talked to you a little bit about the scientific process and what that looks like, and that it's very important that we stay true to making sure that whatever we're teaching and whatever we're delivering is grounded in science and evidence, right? And that's how we identify those techniques that are what I like to use the term diagnostic, the ones that are going to elicit reliable information, but minimize the chance of unreliable information, including false confessions. And I think that this is a group that I don't need to convince why this is important, because from my understanding, most of you are working in the context where you've come across problematic statements, whether they be witness statements or suspect statements, right? And so the problem of false confessions, which Matt was just showing you on the next slide, we know that this is an issue. We can see it in bodies of cases like the DNA exoneration cases, but also the National Registry of Exonerations, where we can look at what were the factors that contributed to these wrongful convictions. And we can see that false confessions in this DNA database occurs in about 29% of cases. And the numbers are different depending on which data set you're working with. One of the things that strikes me about this particular DNA exoneration data set, which is from the Innocence Project, is that if you break it down by type of crime, for example, in homicide cases, for people who are convicted of homicide, the most serious of cases, the false confession rate is actually about 61%. So kind of counterintuitively, people are more likely to confess to murder than less serious cases, which you would think to yourself, okay, well, maybe I'd confess to something minor. It's no big deal, right? The punishment's not too bad. But in fact, it's in exactly the most serious of cases where we see an increase. And I think my personal opinion, which is mostly based on speculation, but informed speculation, is that is precisely the type of case where investigators are more likely to use problematic tactics, because the stakes are so high and because they don't have much else to go on. So we know that false confessions are a problem, but it's not just false confessions. And so if you've worked these types of cases, it's false witness statements, it's secondary confessions that are contributing to these problematic situations and cases. And I'm pretty sure I don't need to convince you that every time we have an innocent person in prison, that means the guilty person is out there, right? And often committing more crimes. And so for me, it's really important for the whole system, the system as a whole, to be looking towards this science-based method where we can really focus in on what works. So Matt, if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to hand it back over to Matt in a few minutes, but I just want to give you a little more detailed history of sort of where we've come as a field. So I mentioned that there's been a lot of research on this, even before the Hague came into existence, about memory, about persuasion, about interviewing. And as we've collected this really good information in terms of how these techniques work in the laboratory, how do we best interview somebody? How do we help them retrieve information? How do we appropriately persuade someone to provide information if they're reluctant to do so? We've learned a lot about how that works in the laboratory. We've gone out into the field and we've done some field studies. And it came to a point where people were ready to start trying to train science-based interviewing. Right? So it's one thing to have this knowledge and understand these are the techniques that work from a research perspective. But the next step is to be able to deliver it, right? So we started to see packaging of science-based techniques into an interview training. But unlike customary interview training, as scientists, as researchers, it's not enough to say, okay, here's the science. But now we need to know, if we do this, if we teach you the science, first of all, are we doing a good enough job of teaching the science that investigators will understand it and go out there and use it? And once they implement these techniques in the quote unquote real world, are they going to work in the way that we expect them to work? So we're kind of putting our money where our mouth is here and saying, you've got to test what you're rolling out, what you're teaching to people, to make sure that it works. That's part of the scientific loop. Okay? So the Hig was one of the first organizations to start delivering their science-based interviewing course, which was originally developed more for the military and intelligence context. But they started what I love this phrase, giving away the science and training other agencies, including law enforcement agencies. And eventually they came to myself and some colleagues of mine, and they said, we'd like to test our training. We want to know if it works. The problem is most of the groups that they were delivering the training to were working in a classified environment. So we couldn't get access to the interviews that they were conducting. And so what we landed up doing is they partnered with a federal law enforcement agency and Air Force OSI, for those of you who might be familiar with that. And they delivered the training, their training, or a version of their training, to Air Force OSI agents. And we came in and we assessed the effectiveness of that training. And we do that by asking two questions. The first is, when we put these science-based techniques together into a training curriculum, if you deliver that training, will investigators use the new techniques, right? Is the training effective at changing practice? That's the training evaluation piece. And then the second piece is, once they go out back into the field, if they deploy these techniques, is it producing better outcomes? Are they getting more cooperation? Are they getting more detailed statements? Are they getting more admissions from in suspect interviews? Okay. So that's the field validation piece. Does it work the way that we think it's going to work? Matt, next slide. So I'm not going to go through all of these training evaluations. These are the evaluations that I've been a part of directly. So I mentioned the first one was with Air Force OSI. We then delivered, the Hig delivered a version of that training to local and state investigators in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, as well as the Tempe Police Department. And what I will summarize is, it turns out that you can effectively package these techniques, right? You can train them, and that when they're implemented in the real world, they can be effective. And we're going to show you some data of what that looks like in a minute, because Matt's going to talk about the training that he and I have been working towards. But I will say that with each of these iterations, we learned something, right? So we learned not only that the training works, but it's really more detailed than that, because some of it worked better than others, right? So they got some concepts more than others. And so we go back and we continually tinker with the training to make sure not only that we're doing it effectively, but that it's of practical use in the field. So Matt is going to talk about what the training curriculum looks like in brief. We're going to share some data with you, and then we'll go more specifically into the content of that training.
Okay, thank you. So back in 2018, Marissa was right. I was one of the first few of local law enforcement to go through the Higgs training. I wasn't the first one. Those were two detectives from LAPD. I believe I was the first one to actually go through the entire curriculum, however. And I was incredibly grateful at the time to Dr. Susan Brandon, who was the research director at the Hig, who openly invited me into these classes with the other federal partners. Imagine myself being in a room with 30 some other investigators from federal agencies, and they're all wondering, how did I get in there? How did I get clearance to attend these classes? So it was kind of a hostile environment in and of itself, just going to the trainings. But from the trainings, what I really took out of it were these networking opportunities with the researchers, and also this passion for developing a training for local law enforcement. Now, in thinking about the type of training that I thought would appeal to local law enforcement, what really struck me is that all the trainings that were being thrown out there to them, none of them focused on the core competencies of what I thought was important for local law enforcement, meaning how to ask questions that were not contaminating an interview, how to effectively use your active listening skills to develop rapport, how to disclose evidence. So there were a lot of areas of these core competencies that were being completely ignored. The error with many of these training curriculums out there is that they were assuming that investigators, whether they had 5 years on or 20 years on, when they would show up to these trainings, would already have these core competencies by the time they got into the training. And this was a tremendous mistake. The other challenge in looking at what was suitable for a 5-day class for local law enforcement was that in looking at the models of resistance and how to address and mitigate resistance in an interview that were out there from the science-based research, some of these were very theoretical. And while they were very interesting, I felt that they were too theoretical for what would be suitable for local law enforcement, and wanted to develop something that was more intuitive, that they could relate to right away and utilize very quickly.
Matt, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you could just explain what you mean by resistance.
Yeah, so resistance can manifest itself in several ways. We have actual resistance where someone's being very condescending towards the investigator, where they are refusing to talk, where they are being avoidant. So there are a lot of different types of resistance that we can see in the interview. Some of these resistance behaviors are very proactive and very intentional. Others are less so. And there are more types of what we call information management strategies, where they're not so much displaying resistance as they are managing their information in terms of what they want to tell you and what they don't want to tell you. And this is a great question. I'm glad you brought this up, Marissa, because I want to make sure that everybody understands. Resistance is always thought of in the area of just with suspects, but we see resistance from eyewitnesses. We see resistance from victims as well. So it's not just with suspects. As I like to tell our investigators, everybody that we talk to has motivations for why they do or do not want to talk to us. It's our job to explore what is behind those motivations. Some people, whether it's a victim or an eyewitness, may want to be, giving us information just because it's the right thing to do. For others, they're motivated by monetary compensation. For other people, for suspects, they may be providing information because they're trying to hide the person who actually committed the crime. So really, it's up to us to find out what their motivations are and what might be supporting the resistance we're seeing in the room. So from that aspect, we wanted to develop a model, and it's not just for resistance, but for the whole 5-day course that was intuitive and had a high degree of internal validity for investigators walking in right away and learning these techniques. The other point, and I really credit the Hague for suggesting this and the way they were presenting their training, is the model of having a practitioner paired up with a researcher as they're presenting these instructional modules. This has been incredibly effective, and we found that the investigators really appreciate hearing from the researchers. More importantly, they really appreciate understanding where the research exists so that they can access it as well. This has been the other challenge in getting science-based techniques out there for investigators to utilize, is they don't understand that the research exists in the first place. And more importantly, they don't understand how to access the research as well. So we developed these teams, practitioner with a researcher, and that's how we conducted the training. The training itself had another component that was missing from prior curriculums, and that were the practical exercises. Okay, the majority of interview training that I had in the first 13 years of my career, we never had to do a single practical exercise in class. We never had to demonstrate competency in the techniques we were being utilized. In all the things we do in local law enforcement, there are expectations of demonstrating competency, whether it's defensive driving, whether it's defensive tactics, whether it's firearms. We have to demonstrate competency. So what we did in this training is we changed the expectation. We want them to understand that they have to demonstrate competency in the techniques by the end of the week. So that was those were a few of the things that we changed in terms of what we were looking for as we were developing this training to be taught to local law enforcement by both a practitioner and a researcher. But Melissa, do you want to talk about the 4 iterations that we then went through with this?
Sure. So once we developed this this course that was designed, and I want to emphasize here, this was led by Matt, right? So this is somebody with a wealth of practical experience who's been in the field, who is coming in with the knowledge of how this needs to be communicated. What is the best way to communicate to the audience that we're seeking to reach, right? And so we developed this course. The Hague funded a field validation for us, which is the data that we'll share. And the way that we actually conduct these studies is that we had, in this case, we had 43 different investigators across 3 different police departments. And we had them submit pre and post training suspect interviews. So these were actual interviews they conducted out in the field prior to training and after training. And once we had these interviews, we would de-identify them, right? Make them anonymous. And then we would code them, we would score them. We had independent scorers, not Matt and I, but people who were trained to code is just a fancy way of saying scoring for a variety of different techniques to see what techniques they were using. And then also our outcome variables, cooperation, information gain, how detailed they were, whether they made admissions during these suspect interviews. Okay, so remember, there's 2 questions we're looking to answer. One, does the training affect their use of the techniques? That's the training evaluation. And then how does it all come together? Does it impact those outcome variables that we care about? So Matt's going to show you the next slide. And we're going to go over the emphasis of what the different content is after this. But for each of these bars, this is representing a focus in the course. So for example, how to use productive questioning, something called the cognitive interview, which some of you may be familiar with, and I'll talk about more in a few minutes.
So,
rapport.
Alyssa, I'm sorry if I could just interrupt. As a lawyer, my head is exploding looking at P's and D's and
yes, I know. I'm gonna, here's how you read this chart.
Thank you.
So if you see a bar, right? So post training, if the bar is above the x-axis, which is just the line, that means there was an increase in the use of those techniques. So there's an increased use of productive questioning after training. There's an increased use of cognitive interview, and so on and so forth. The P's and the D's, don't worry about it. I left it in there in case there are scientific-y type people in the room. What you care about is that red star. That red star means statistically significant effect, and the size of the bar gives you a sense of how big of an impact there was. So there was a bigger impact on, say, cognitive interview than productive, but all of these are good effects. The evidence disclosure, you see a slightly shaded star. That means it was approaching significance in the world of researchers. We'd had no effect on their use of accusatorial tactics, because we also scored for that, the more traditional stuff. And the training did not decrease it in a significant way, which is something that we learned from, because what it taught us is we can't just expect people, if we train them on the new stuff, to stop doing the old stuff. We have to be much more proactive at saying, here's what you shouldn't do anymore. And that's something the prior trainings stayed away from, because it's a touchy subject, right? We are actually much more aggressive, I would say, is the word, assertive, in saying, okay, I know that this is what you're currently doing. Here's what's the problem. And here's what maybe we can salvage from that, but here's why you should stay away from theming, and you should stay away from lying about evidence. Okay. So this slide just tells you that the training was effective. We see a change in tactics post-training. The next slide, if this was overwhelming for you, the next one's really going to make your head explode, Marissa. So what I'm going to show you now is called a path model. Basically, what we can do is we can put all this data into an analysis to help us understand what predicts what affects what. So I'm going to take it slow, and hopefully, if there's any questions, let me know.
Right.
So
getting my aspirin ready just in case.
Okay. So when we train people, remember I said it had an effect on their use of the techniques, the science-based techniques. So Matt, go ahead and create that bar for me. All right, so the way you read this is when you see an arrow leading from one block to another, that means the training caused an increase in the use of science-based tactics, right? When you train them, they use more science-based tactics. We created this one big factor of representing the science-based tactics. Okay. From there, we want to know, does the use of the science-based tactics affect those really key important things like cooperation and information gain? Because ultimately that's what we're looking for. And in fact, it does. So hold there, Matt. I don't want to overwhelm anyone, right? So the use of the science-based tactics, when they're used, it increases cooperation by the suspects. And it also directly increases disclosure. I am keeping an eye on the chat, and I promise I'll get there. Okay, so we measured 2 things, cooperation and how much information they provide. and the use of the science-based tactics, when they're used, they increase both of those things. Cooperation also directly increases disclosure. Right? So when you get somebody into a cooperative state, you're increasing the likelihood that they're going to disclose. And importantly, especially for law enforcement, disclosure increases the likelihood of making self-incriminating statements and admissions. Okay. Now, somebody asked in the chat, what is MI? MI is in fact motivational interviewing. Very nice job, Brooke. And we're going to talk about what that means in a few minutes. So that's part of the science-based package of techniques that we're training in that week. The other thing that we can do in this PATH model is not just look at what effect the science-based tactics have, but looking at what the effect of those accusatorial tactics are, right? The traditional stuff that they're still using. And what we find here is a very consistent effect of what we've found, not only in this data set, but in many other data sets in the field and in the laboratory, which is despite the fact that there is a notion out there that accusatorial tactics, the confrontational stuff, is the way that you get people to talk to you, it actually increases resistance. So the use of those accusatorial tactics increase what we call counter-interrogation tactics or behaviors, which is resistance. I don't want to talk to you, disengaging, I don't remember, right? Not being willing to provide, which in turn decreases cooperation. So Matt's going to put up a bar right now. Notice that the arrow is red. That's me telling you that's a negative relationship. So the more resistance behavior, the less cooperation. And the less cooperation, the less information, the fewer the admissions and confessions. So we have this effect on increasing resistance and also just directly decreasing cooperation. Okay. I know this is a bit of an overwhelming slide, but I want you to understand not only is it important to understand if the training is impacting practice, but we also want to make sure that the techniques are operating in the real world the way that we would expect them to. And that's what we learned from this data. Are there any questions on this before we move on? I'm not seeing any. There was a question in the chat about memory, and I'm going to address it. I haven't ignored it. I just know where I'm going to do it so that it fits in. Okay, Matt.
Okay, so thank you. So when we put together this 5-day course back in 2018, this is the outline of what we initially started with. And I just want to go through these main modules that are in the bold print here so that everybody can understand exactly what we were training to these investigators. We started out, excuse me, on Monday morning with the course introduction. What's important about the introduction is this is where we set up the expectation for these investigators. This class that we were teaching was not only designed to educate them about the techniques in terms of science-based interviewing, but it was also to educate them about how to provide constructive feedback to one another out in the field. One of the things that we are seeing consistently is that investigators are not getting feedback on the things that they are doing well and the things that they can improve upon with their interviewers. There is nobody sitting in the monitor room that's saying, hey, you're asking too many leading questions. You know, you didn't prepare enough for the subject interview. They're not getting that type of feedback. We see small pockets, for example, in sex crime units that have to do peer review interviews every quarter, where they are actually providing feedback to one another. But by and large, we're not seeing that feedback. So we really encourage the students to take over the coaching role for us after we get past Tuesday. By that point in time, we expect them to start providing feedback to their peers as we are going through these practical exercises. Right after that, we have the foundational concepts. And this is where it's important for us to talk about the terminology and the concepts that we're going to be teaching for the week, and also make sure that they are on the same page in terms of what we are referring to. There are a lot of different terms out there, especially related to theming tactics and other practices that have been used for a long time. And we want to make sure everybody understands a common language. The other part of this, though, is right in this first hour, we are identifying for everybody what we are not going to be teaching. And this is really a sensitive module to talk about, because this is where we explain to the students, we are not going to be teaching you how to use theming tactics. We are not going to be teaching you to lie to people. We are not going to be teaching you to present false evidence, use the alternative question, present forced choice questions. All these concepts that have been taught for the last 80 years that we know are risk factors for encouraging or eliciting a false confession, we are telling them right away we're not going to be teaching. For some people, this creates a lot of anxiety because this is what they have based all their success on in their interviews for the entire time that they've been on the job. What we are telling them is that we're going to provide you with options of techniques that are more diagnostic and are going to be more helpful for you to elicit actionable intelligence. Okay, so right away in foundational concepts, we are addressing this issue. This third module on prep and planning. Initially, when we conducted these trainings, prep and planning was always the area that we received the lowest scores of interest from people when they talked about what they enjoyed most during the week. Since that time, we have invested a lot of time and energy to improve the way that we present prep and planning to investigators. And now this is one of the most highly rated components of the entire week. Most investigators have never been taught how to prepare for an interview. The expectation was always as if their supervisor came to them and asked them what was their goal for the interview. They would say the goal was to get a confession. We are training investigators that if that is the only thing they can say, they have not adequately prepared for this interview. They should be able to explain to their supervisor what they've done to prepare in terms of identifying information that's been vetted, that's not been vetted. They should explain to their supervisor that they've considered alternative reasons of who and why this crime may have been committed. They should be able to explain to their supervisor that they've developed an evidence disclosure plan with the available evidence they have, and they've also identified a prioritization of how they're going to disclose the evidence if they need to. So there's a lot more involved here in prep and planning than just going in and having a conversation. And that's how I was trained. I was trained just to go in the room and have a conversation. That was the extent of prep and planning that we did in the past. After that, we have framing questions and funneling. Okay, this idea of how to frame a productive question. I think that this module right here is the most important module from the entire week. It's, when you look at these other modules for resistance and credibility assessment, evidence disclosure, all of those are dependent upon productive questions being asked that are non-suggestive and non-leading. Okay. That's why we spend a lot of time here just removing bad habits in terms of question strategies. And then once we develop good habits in terms of them asking productive questions, we show them how to funnel those questions down to reach an objective using a funnel questioning framework. So that whole first day is about removing bad habits and start laying the foundation for everything else that we're going to do the entire week. On Tuesday, we start out with active listening, and this has been the one area that's been neglected in interview training tremendously, and this would be right up there with framing questions in terms of its value for productive interviews. After that, we do practical exercises where they have to demonstrate proficiency in using their active listening skills. After that, we move into rapport building and also motivational interviewing. And this is where we talk about the concepts of rapport, common ground, liking, flattery and compliments, reciprocity that are important for establishing a relationship. Motivational interviewing concepts refer to an interview curriculum that was initially developed by clinical psychologists to help people with alcohol addiction motivate themselves to get over their own addiction issues. And there's been 5 principles that have been identified from the motivational interviewing literature that we also see very productive in investigators that are conducting really good interviews. And we'll talk more about those components later. But motivational interviewing and rapport is a whole block in and of itself, because we want these investigators to think about that they are not establishing a short-term relationship with these people. Many of these people that they're having contact with during this investigation, they're going to see again. Okay, so we want them to start changing the framework of how they look at this interview, to think of it as a long-term relationship and establish that through the use of rapport and motivational interviewing principles. And then we round out the day with resistance. Here's where we talk to investigators about not only identifying what resistance looks like, what it feels like, but also what are the strategies, more importantly, that we can use to mitigate resistance, not only before it occurs, but also once we're involved in the interview and we see it cropping up. What are those mitigation strategies that we can use to hopefully explore what resistance is and resolve it if we can? The other thing that we're doing here with resistance is we are reframing the way it is perceived by investigators. We want them to stop looking at resistance as an obstacle and look at it as a fantastic opportunity to find out how this person is perceiving this investigation. Why won't they talk with us? Why are they not providing us with credible information? It's a great opportunity for us to explore that. So we're reframing the whole way we look at resistance. Melissa, you want to touch on memory in the cognitive interview for Wednesday?
Sure. So Wednesday, we spend the day starting out by helping them to understand memory. Because when you're talking about getting information from somebody, it's all about pulling that information from memory. So if you don't understand how memory works, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. And also, if you know how memory works, you can use it to your advantage to be more effective. So we have a block where we're sort of giving them the science of memory. We try not to overwhelm them. And then we move into the cognitive interview. Now, let me just stop. There was a question about memory being malleable. And asking if that is my understanding. And it is absolutely my understanding. And I could talk to you for a couple of hours just about this topic, and I'm happy to do that some other time. But memory is fragile. You all know, I'm sure, that mistaken eyewitness identifications are the #1 contributor to wrongful convictions, and that has everything to do with memory, right? And the good news is that if you understand how memory works, and you use proper techniques, you can elicit reliable information, understanding that there are going to be constraints. So we talk to them about that. We talk to them about how easy it is to manipulate memory, how by simply asking a suggestive question, even if they don't realize it's suggestive, that can affect the information that they're getting from a person, right? And then from there, we move into the cognitive interview. For those of you who don't know what that is, that was a protocol that was developed initially for cooperative witnesses and victims, and has now been adapted to be used with suspects as well. Because as I said before, good interviewing doesn't change whether you're dealing with a witness or a victim or suspect. It's all the same. There's just some additional layers with suspect interviewing. So we show them a cognitive interview, which is a protocol that uses what we know about how memory works and also incorporates social dynamics and communication. We demonstrate it for them. I do a lecture, or whoever's doing the lecture, we explain the science of it. We explain the different techniques that are a part of it, and there are many. We spend a day on this, right? So I can't do it justice in a couple of minutes. And then importantly, we spend the afternoon where each one of them not only conducts a cognitive interview, but they have a cognitive interview conducted on them so they can experience what it's like to go through those memory retrieval techniques. And we not only want them to see, so on Wednesday, they see what it looks like when someone is going through a cognitive interview and searching their memory when they're telling the truth. Because Thursday is when we talk about deception and what that looks like and how you can use these same techniques with somebody who is potentially being deceptive. So Matt, do you want to take it from there?
Sure. Real quick, Melissa, do you want to touch on here, for a lot of the folks that are here from the conviction integrity units that are dealing with cases that have been 5, 10, 15, 20 years old, how is the cognitive interview going to be helpful for them going back and recontacting people?
Yeah, I mean, so anytime that I know many of you either are investigators or work with investigators who are having to go back and re-interview people from years ago, right? The cognitive interview is fantastic training for anyone who has to elicit information from anyone in any context, but especially if it's a searching your memory context. So even if we're talking about an event that happened many years ago, there is utility to going through a cognitive interview and re-interviewing that person. And you would be surprised how the level of detail with people can recall from 10, 15 years ago when you're using the principles of memory to help them remember. And that is the bread and butter of the cognitive interview. So absolutely for investigators who need to re-interview, this is exactly what you want to understand for anyone, witness, victim, subject.
Okay, thank you. So then on Thursday, we start out the morning on Thursday with credibility assessment. And what I like about day 4 or Thursday in the curriculum is that this is where we tie together everything that we have taught the entire week into the framework to show them how they can use it from start to finish. However, credibility assessment is a topic that is more widely researched than any other area in investigative interviewing. And it also is a topic that many interview companies realize is of such interest to local law enforcement. I am trying to do my best to change the perception of credibility assessment for interviews for investigators. And here's why. At the end of the day, if I can go to a prosecutor and I say, hey, I can tell you that he's lying. I know he's lying. Oftentimes what I will hear back from the prosecutor is, so what? You still need to prove your case. And that is a really important point that I don't think is explained well enough to investigators, that they are so consumed with identifying people who are being deceptive that they miss out on other areas in the investigation that are more important and of more value to prosecutors when you're submitting these cases. So credibility assessment here is where we really break a lot of hearts, and we see some tears from the investigators, because we explain to them that the research shows that looking at nonverbal cues to identifying people that are being deceptive is not very accurate, horribly inaccurate, in fact. And we instead spend our time for that entire module teaching them about the more diagnostic cues, which are the verbal cues. And to that point, I will then get up after we teach the module on credibility assessment, and I will do a demonstration for them in front of the class where we have 2 people come in. One subject may be lying and one may be telling the truth, or they both may be telling the truth, or they both may be lying. And the students are then tasked with identifying, using the techniques we've just taught them, focusing on verbal cues, not the nonverbal, in terms of who might be credible. I will tell you that even when it goes horribly wrong and they can't identify who it is, that's a win for us, because they recognize very quickly how hard it is and how much energy it takes to identify people who are being deceptive. So it is a great module for them to start changing their perception on not only how to identify people who are being deceptive, but how challenging it is. After that, we move into evidence disclosure. And this is a very important module for myself. I've spent the last 2 years working on an evidence disclosure project with Simon Oleskiewicz from the Netherlands. Some of you here today have gotten to already participate in that 2-day class on proximity-based evidence disclosure. And this is where we are teaching investigators a whole new way to look at evidence disclosure. Number one, investigators all across the country have never been taught how to evaluate the reliability of evidence. That's pretty important, wouldn't you say? That if we're going to be submitting cases to be charged, we should start to understand that evidence, whether it's physical evidence, technological evidence, or statement evidence, all has limitations. And we need to understand what those limitations are and how they affect reliability. After that, once we start to teach investigators how to assess reliability, we want them to teach how to disclose evidence and how to do it in an ethical way without contaminating the information they're getting. And this is where we prepare investigators to develop an evidence disclosure plan. And this is a really important step in terms of giving them a strategy, an operational purpose for what this interview is going to accomplish. So we spend the whole afternoon talking about evidence disclosure and taking them through practical exercises to get them to use those techniques. And then finally, we close out the training on Thursday afternoon with reliability of statements. And Melissa, you want to take us through that and what we do to close out Friday as well?
Sure. So when we first started doing these trainings, the purpose of this module was to teach them about false confessions. What are the risk factors? What are the different types of false confessions? We recognize that they're going to go back out into the field. They're going to be working with other people who are using those more traditional accusatorial approaches. So it's a module where we want them to understand what the red flags are, what they should be looking for, what techniques to stay away from. And then more recently, I've started to add a section on how to evaluate the reliability of a statement that you've taken. Again, whether it's witness, victim, subject, or suspect. And so what I did was I used a framework that I use when I serve as an expert consultant on cases. So I will serve as an expert where usually a defense attorney will contact me, sometimes prosecution, and they say, we think we might have an issue of a false confession. And I explain to them the analysis that I use when I'm essentially being a Monday morning quarterback. of looking at the reliability of a statement. And I walk them through that process, and teach them essentially what they should be doing so that hopefully we avoid the wrongful convictions. Hopefully I don't have to see these cases later on if they can use that same process to then kind of stop the path to a wrongful conviction or an unreliable witness statement or victim statement. So we don't have time. I know that we want to leave times for questions, so I'm not going to go into much more detail than that, but I'm happy to answer questions after.
All right. Did you want to discuss the practical exercise for Friday, Melissa?
Sure. So then Friday is all about spending the day putting this into practice. So Matt, do you want to flip to the next slide, actually?
Yeah.
We give them an overview of what an interview should look like. And this is the overview that we give them. And remember that we're teaching them not just how to conduct suspect interviews, but witnesses and victims as well. And we give them this framework, and then we say, but it doesn't always go exactly like this. This is a typical kind of flow of the interview process as we see it, but there's flexibility to move in and out of things. So for example, you might spend some time doing active rapport building, but you have to weave rapport building throughout the process. You might get to a point where you're disclosing evidence, but then you stop and you move back into the cognitive interview technique. So even though it's set up, or it looks like it's this linear step-by-step process, it really isn't. And Friday is about them understanding how to put this into practice. So on Friday, they spend all day in practical exercises where they are interviewing a suspect. It's a very immersive exercise. These are not role players. They are not acting. We put them through an actual experience where they commit a crime. And so they're working with true memories, because we spend all week talking about how memory works. If we had them pretending, it doesn't work. And they are ultimately doing the suspect interview with the goal of implementing all of the techniques that they have been working with all week. So Matt, I don't know if you want to say anything more, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, the only thing I want to say is that while we provide this slide to the students of how this process could go, one of my pet peeves about prior interview curriculums is providing, a framework like this that everything's going to flow easily from step to step to step. What we are spending our time on doing this entire week with the students is teaching them how to be adaptable. We want them to be adaptable in the moment in the interview, and to recognize when they have these other areas of where they can use components of the cognitive interview, where they can pause the interview to do some rapport building or focus on resolving resistance. We want them to be adaptable and not get into a flow chart mentality. When we see students that come from other interview curriculums that have this flow chart mentality, they really struggle when it comes time to an interview if things don't go the way that the flow chart tells them to go. So we really focus on the adaptability of being in the moment and being present, and feeling comfortable that when you do get resistance, when you do have opportunities to show empathy, to pause and do evidence disclosure, to take advantage of these opportunities and recognize them. So this is just a nice way of saying, here's the initial process, but it's not going to go this way, as Melissa already mentioned. Okay, I think we are out of time. All right. I would like to open this up to questions, Marissa, if there are any pending questions. I know there was one about where to get the training.
Right.
Right.
So while Matt's searching for that, I want to say that if this sounds like an advertisement for the training program, it's not meant to be that, although we will discuss that in a moment. But to get across that, not just about what we know about false confessions and how they're generated by coercive and accusatory tactics, but that science tells us there are ways to do it differently, and that there are individuals who are diligently developing those other techniques that we should be using, not just necessarily for law enforcement, but as Dr. Rossano said, even for folks who are involved in investigating now. And when you're conducting these interviews, when you're out there talking to witnesses, when you're trying to piece together what happened, having knowledge of the science of what may have led to a false confession is incredibly helpful to have. But how to do it differently and better so that we are getting information which is generated by an actual memory and which is helpful, that's kind of the goal here. So, Matt, I don't know if you were able to find that question you were looking for, but... let you take that.
Yeah, so I think the question was, how can departments get this training? As Marissa said, we did not want this to turn into a training advertisement for what we are doing. We wanted this to be an educational seminar today, and we continue to want to do that with all of you moving forward. If you have agencies that are interested in training, please feel free to reach out to myself. Melissa, I think we have our contact information. We didn't pull it up there at the end, but you can provide my contact information to everybody. We're more than happy to talk about the type of trainings we offer. Some of you that are on the call today have had an opportunity to sit through the 2-day class on evidence disclosure, and I think part of the 5-day class. If you would like to share anything with anybody here about those, please feel free to, in terms of what you found of value and what you found was not of value as well. But yeah, we are more than happy to have other discussions in terms of how to provide the training. We do provide a lot of training in a virtual format, which we found to be quite successful. I was actually very hesitant to do this, but thanks to Melissa, who's had a lot of experience doing this with her students, I found it to be quite enjoyable and also extremely effective in terms of teaching these techniques to students as well as being in person. So.
And if I could just interject, one of the things that we at the Quattrone Center are particularly interested in is trying to help prosecutors and defense lawyers either attend this training or help modify the training to fit your needs. So I'm going to launch a poll now for those who might be interested in either attending or helping to put together a modified training for folks. If you are, please fill out the poll. We will follow up with you quickly. So let me relaunch that now.
Matt, there was a question in the chat about have you researched what happens when evidence disclosure is moved to the beginning of the process? It's a great question, Greg. So actually, traditionally, that's what law enforcement tend to do. So if you look at sort of standard interviewing models, there's usually this portion where they say it's the information gathering portion, presumably, right? Getting the information. It's really about detecting deception in many situations. And then there's a switch in the interview and they say, okay, we know that you did it. I don't need you to tell me that you did it. I just want to give you an opportunity to explain why you did it. And it moves into this accusatorial shift. And oftentimes investigators are actually taught to dump their evidence right in the early stages to overcome resistance, right? I know you did, I've got your fingerprints, I got this, I got an eyewitness, blah, blah, blah. And it's all designed to overwhelm them. Well, and there has been research on this, and it is far more effective to do a later disclosure of the evidence and do an incremental disclosure of the evidence. So the reason for that is what you want to do is you want to lock the person into their story. And what I mean by that is I want to get a really good, accurate recall using my really good memory recall techniques so that I've given them every opportunity to explain in as much detail as they can the potential discrepancies I have with their story and their evidence. And then I'm going to give them a piece of evidence and I'm going to see what happens. They're going to have to make a decision. Either me giving that evidence is going to make, if it's an innocent person, they're going to say, oh, you know what, actually, and they're going to explain that piece of evidence. A guilty person is going to have to make a decision of whether they're going to shift their story, shift their narrative, right, or make an admission. And we do that incrementally, and we wait until we've gotten a solid narrative. The other danger of putting your evidence out early is that suspects or whoever it is are able to shape their story to fit your evidence. And that's not a good strategy. So without going, there's more benefits to waiting, but that's the short answer is yes, there's been research and it supports later incremental disclosure.
Can I interject just a second by audio?
Sure.
Right ahead, Greg.
So just quickly, how does that compare with other cognitive interviewing processes like behavioral modification? In other words, if you're working, as I understand it, with a client who's trying to stop an addictive behavior, et cetera, you don't withhold evidence of their behavior till late. You start out with, or you early on introduce rational evidence to counter irrational views. But it seems like here there's still a part of deception that's going on, and maybe that has to be, and that you are withholding what you know. You are not showing your cards till later. And is there any reason, do we know for sure that works better in this setting? And you're saying yes so far, I guess.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I would categorize withholding information as deception in the way that we traditionally think about it, but absolutely, we train, and the research supports investigators using their own information management strategy. So that, as I said, if you give evidence right at the outset, the person you're interviewing has the ability to shape their story to fit that evidence. And so the power of presenting evidence often gets undercut right off the bat. In terms of an analogy to behavioral modification, I would say that the goal here, I guess if you're thinking of behavioral modification as stop lying to me, right? And if I show you evidence of your lying, maybe that's where you're going with it. What we tend to find is if you accuse somebody of lying and you say, I know you're lying, actually that tends to shut them down. And if you do that too early in the interview, you're getting nothing from them. So what you want to do is give them every opportunity to tell you the truth first, and make sure you've explored the possibility that they are in fact telling the truth. When you go in there with that accusatorial mindset of I have evidence and I'm going to accuse you of doing it, you're also going down that tunnel vision road, which is very dangerous. So we're training them to rethink about their evidence, to think about alternative possibilities, and to use it very strategically.
Yeah, if I can just expand on what Melissa said here, Greg, because it's a really good question. One of the challenges is that with eyewitnesses, victims, and suspects, we always have discrepancies between things they tell us and things that we know in terms of vetted information and or potential evidence we have. We are training investigators to stop coming in with a guilt presumptive mindset that everybody they talk to is guilty or is being deceptive. We are teaching them instead to hold back this information, collect an initial account, and we want them to explore innocence instead of presuming guilt. We want them to explore every possible explanation as to why this person had nothing to do with this potential crime. If they can't do that anymore, then they need to do further investigation as to why this person might have been involved in that. So exploring the innocence is more of a priority here. And to that point, if we have a discrepancy, we want them to explore all of the plausible explanations as to why that discrepancy exists. We can't do that if we provide all the information up front in the interview. And that's why we're holding that back, because for an eyewitness, for a victim, we want to make sure we're getting credible information from them. And that enhances the integrity of the investigation overall, which is good for everybody. And it also is good from a procedural justice standpoint, because we're doing it in a way where we're not using theming tactics, false evidence, poison, lying to people. Does that resonate with you, Greg? Okay.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I just have to think, is it different with a victim versus a suspect? What you do with that? I mean, it still seems to me that is the honeymoon's over when I say, you've told me this story, but here's the evidence. And a lot of this seems to be accepting and developing rapport, but man, there's still that gotcha. And as long as there's that, as long as you have research that shows it, I'm willing to follow your model. But
yeah, so Greg, I don't want you to follow the model. I want you to be skeptical. I want you to come in with the same attitude you have right now, because I love the skepticism here and the curiosity. But we are teaching them to treat victims, witnesses, and suspects the same way. Okay? That is really what we're trying to drive home here, is that we want investigators to be curious. Traditionally, investigators are curious only about the crime.
You get her any?
We are teaching investigators to be curious about who this person is in front of them. There won't be a gotcha moment. We're going to keep on being curious no matter what. And that's the difference in the mentality we're trying to get across to everybody that we train with this.
So, Lisa Lazari-Strazer, I don't know if you had a question, because you had unmuted there for a second, but if so, please feel free to ask. Others, we're waning time, but please feel free to ask more questions if you have. And we have launched an evaluation poll, which we would appreciate you completing before you sign off. But we'll wait to see if there's some more questions here.
And I know some of you may have to go, but I'm happy to stay on if some people need to leave.
Okay, so it being 3:15, then we will officially say thank you, everyone, and especially thank you to Detective Jones and to Dr. Rossano for your time with us today. Greg is clapping. He doesn't do that very often, so that's high praise. There you go. We will follow up with those who said that they would like to work on a training for your organization, certainly. And we will be back at our regular time next month on the second Wednesday of the month from 2 to 3:15. Hope to see you all there. But I will keep the Zoom open if folks want to have some questions for Matt or Melissa. But again, thank you both so much.